Welcome back to the Definitive Analysis of Tenet. This series of videos is meant to provide a more complete understanding of the film's narrative and conceptual elements. It's a research tool to be used as a companion to the original movie. In this episode, I cover the protagonist's journey from the wind farm to the Tenet Lab, as well as the Mumbai sequence of meeting Neil and Priya. If you're looking for something in particular, use the chapter markers in the timeline below. Here we go. The protagonist is dropped at an offshore wind turbine where he spends an unspecified period of time. This is a fairly straightforward transitional sequence, serving as a bridge between his old life in the CIA and his new life in Tenet. He's eventually picked up by a crew transfer boat, taken ashore, and led to a car with a destination pre-programmed into its GPS. The protagonist finds a new silver suicide pill in the bag that's been left for him, and it's my understanding that this pill is the real deal, not another fake like the one he ate earlier. So is the one Sator has near the end of the film, as well as the one the protagonist was carrying in his uniform during the opera siege. There's a line in the screenplay which addresses this. The protagonist asks if the CIA pills are fake, meaning all of them. Faye clarifies, "We replaced yours with a sedative." The line didn't make it into the movie, possibly because it's a bit confusing, since the protagonist didn't take his pill. But I think it hints at something deeper. The pill the protagonist ate came from Target, and he presumably got that pill out of the clothes he was wearing, which came from Well-Dressed Man. If Well-Dressed Man was getting close to Sator, as I theorized in my previous video, it makes sense that he was set up for the fake pill test. The protagonist's improvisation messes up that plan, but he ends up eating the fake pill instead, thus passing the test. So Faye pulls him into the Tenet fold, and he eventually becomes Priya's new protagonist.
Did you think you were the only one capable of saving the world?
When you think about the story in this way, there's a skeleton of naturally occurring events that Tenet and the protagonist need to find a way to work around and within. Now, to me, that's a lot more interesting than the giant bootstrap approach, where everything is set up by the future because that's how they saw it occur in the past. The wind turbines symbolize the rotational nature of inversion. Near the end of the film, as the Magna Viking makes its way to Stalsk 12, it also passes through a wind farm. It's never explicitly stated, but it seems like we're meant to assume that the protagonist is actually doing conventional pull-ups inside one of these turbines, while at the same time on the Magna Viking, he's doing inverted pull-ups. And for an even deeper conceptual detail, consider the fact that pull-ups are the same regardless of which way you run the tape. I'd also like to point out this absolutely horrific image. Licorice is gross, but leaving it for a person who just had their jaw rebuilt is cruel and unusual. Making it vegan on top of all that is downright barbaric. The GPS leads to an office complex, and the protagonist's first opportunity to use his new password and gang sign.
And I'm scared Tenet.
Barbara takes him into her lab and explains the basics of inversion. The protagonist asks for an analysis of the inverted bullets in the lab so he can track their production source. Like us, he thinks inversion is cool, but not a global threat.
I'm not saying Armageddon here.
So Barbara takes him to an archive with hundreds of drawers and shows that they hold inverted objects, which she theorizes are
the detritus of a coming war.
Now, that explanation can actually work without breaking the movie's rules of fatalistic progression. You can imagine that in the future, inverted people gather this inverted material and store it in the lab. From their perspective, the objects would remain in the lab through all of Barbara's testing and eventually be taken by Tenet people and scattered around the world. From Barbara's perspective, the objects would have been found in the past, gathered, and then brought to her lab. It works, but I don't like it. Let me explain why. Barbara seems to exist in somewhat of a vacuum within the Tenet organization. She receives inverted material, she analyzes and studies it, and she avoids information about anything else. 2 different times, and a third time in the screenplay, she makes a point of keeping the conversation focused on what she's cleared to discuss and nothing else.
No small talk. Nothing that might reveal who we are or what we do.
So she's underinformed about the macro situation, which works for the narrative, but it means her understanding is based on partial data. It's my belief that this is by design, and her ominous statement is meant to provide a temporary threat for the audience and the protagonist until we learn more about the actual threat. Furthermore, I think Tenet purposely keeps Barbara isolated because she is the person who will eventually develop early inversion technology and the first turnstile, And this requires not only an organic process of discovery on her part, but also an ignorance to the dangers of her work. Here's how I imagine that happening. Barbara analyzes inverted objects and their radiation, eventually understanding it well enough to create the first turnstile, but it doesn't seem to work. She tries inverting normal objects, reverting inverted objects, but nothing ever happens. Then she realizes that if an inversion is going to work, she would already have the matching inverted object in the present, and would need to place them in opposite sides of the turnstile when activating it, which leads her to the concept of the proving window.
You don't see yourself in the proving window, do not enter the machine.
So she goes into the archives, searching the drawers of inverted material, looking for something she recognizes, until she finally spots it. Some simple object, a button that perfectly matches those on her brand new blouse. But this button's inverted, and it's been sitting in a drawer for months. She takes it back to the lab, puts it in the blue side of the turnstile, pops a button off her blouse and places it in the red side. She fires up the turnstile and bam, both buttons disappear into the past. She alerts her Tenet contact to the development and asks them to start delivering shipments of random conventional objects, knowing that they won't actually be random. They'll match inverted objects in her archives. She finally understands that collecting and studying the inverted objects was just the first half of the process. She now has to collect the originals and send them into the past to complete the first ever temporal pincer. In addition to the boxes of random objects, she also receives a box of bullets, and she doesn't even have to look. She immediately knows they're a perfect match for the inverted rounds that have been flying out of the chunk of concrete in the shooting range. By the way, there's also a fan theory that suggests Barbara, or perhaps the baby in her belly, is the scientist who creates the algorithm in the future. The supporting evidence is that both Barbara and the algorithm's creator are female scientists, and that Barbara would be familiar with inversion technology. It's one of several Hitchcockian double theories that don't necessarily present meaningful implications for our characters, their relationships, or the events of the movie, but they're fun to consider. If you've ever wondered how the protagonist knows where to go once he reaches the office complex, it's actually explained in the screenplay. He checks the directory when he arrives and sees a listing for wind farm transitions. This bit may have been filmed and cut from the final edit for time or pacing, but I think it's cool how it strongly suggests that the wind farm to lab process is an orientation of sorts that many or all new Tenet recruits undergo. Among the formulas and equations on the lab's whiteboard is a diagram of something called Maxwell's demon. In this thought experiment, physicist James Maxwell proposed a method for decreasing a system's entropy, which is essentially what the movie's inversion technology accomplishes. So it makes sense that Barbara would visit the experiment as she works to understand inversion, but it also serves as a nod to a source of inspiration for Nolan's concepts. Analysis of the bullets from the lab leads the protagonist to an arms dealer in Mumbai, India, Sanjay Singh. He calls an old CIA contact,
We live in a twilight world.
No friends at dusk.
requesting an assist to get him close to Singh, and the contact sets him up with Neil. This is their first meeting, from the protagonist's perspective, but Neil of course already knows him, which is referenced in a clever bit of dialogue. Neil orders a specific drink for the protagonist, and then calls him out when he tries to pretend Neil got it wrong.
Well, I prefer soda water.
No, you don't.
The gambit here is that Neil will appear to be a well-informed, highly competent operative, and it's being played by Neil against the protagonist, but also by Christopher Nolan against the audience. And on an even deeper level, Neil playfully using information as a harmless weapon sets up the very serious business of utilizing ignorance as both sword
Ignorance is our ammunition.
and shield.
This ignorance is our only protection.
Neil hints at a plan to gain access to the Singh's high-rise before the scene comes to a close. In my understanding of the movie, Neil is given very few specific instructions from the future protagonist. His first of these limited orders would be to take an inverted weapon to the Kiev Opera House on the 14th, prepared to watch the protagonist back. The second, to tail the getaway van and rescue the protagonist after he drops at the rail yard. The third and final order would be to approach the protagonist's CIA contact using the Twilight World Challenge and make himself available in Mumbai.
I'll see who's on deck.
Beyond that, it's not necessary for Neil to have any information about what's to come, which means that information would have been suppressed. So all of Neil's actions and interactions through the course of the movie are spontaneous rather than premeditated. He has agency, as much as anyone else, which I think is important to the story and the character.
It's not an excuse to do nothing.
And if you're wondering who the guy on the phone is, don't. The story needs someone the protagonist trusts to set him up with Neil. That's all. So we get an old contact who gives off serious, seasoned vet vibes as he casually rolls through the challenge password exchange, remains unfazed by the news that a CIA agent has risen from the dead, and knows not to ask any questions.
Time isn't the problem. It's getting out alive is the problem.
This line from Neil is so on brand with the theme of Tenet, I'm actually a little surprised it wasn't a tagline on movie posters. He also asks,
Would you take a child hostage? A woman?
There's a theory that Neil is the adult version of Kat's son, Max. I'm not going to unpack that whole theory in this video, but proponents of it point to these lines as a piece of evidence in support of it. They claim that Neil seems to be fishing for information to satisfy his own curiosity, to see how the protagonist might treat his mother and younger self, rather than offering a sensible strategy to gain access to Singh. The protagonist and Neil launch themselves to different levels of Singh's high-rise. Neil locks down the on-site security team, while the protagonist grabs Sanjay and begins interrogating him at gunpoint. Priya triggers an alarm at first, but as the situation becomes more dire, she has an idea. She flashes her Tenet credentials,
To say anything about a client would violate the tenets he lives by.
and the protagonist responds in kind.
If tenets are important to you, then you can tell me.
They transition to a civil conversation, and we learn that Priya is actually running the Singh arms empire, not her husband. She also seems to be a senior member of the Tenet organization, as she's both well-informed and connected. She points the protagonist in the direction of Andrei Sator, and explains in broad strokes how he's communicating with people in the future, and serving as a broker between their time and the present. She also tells him about a contact who will help him get close to Sator just before police arrive at the building. The protagonist and Neil exit and disappear into the crowded street below. It's my understanding that this is the first time Priya becomes aware of the protagonist, which is why she doesn't recognize him and hits the alarm at first. He was just another recruit who passed the test and was sent to the lab via the wind farm so he could be called upon as needed. But unlike other recruits, he was savvy, resourceful, and ambitious enough to not only track down the source of the bullets in the lab, but also gain access to the Singhs in pursuit of that lead. This is what makes Priya take notice, and gets her thinking that he could be the next protagonist capable of getting near Sator. The protagonist and Neil's entrance is a mirror of their exit, a bungee jump both into and out of the building. So this scene, like several others in the film, is somewhat of a palindrome. We're also introduced to the idea of a false front, with Sanjay acting as the head of the Singh Empire so that Priya can run things from behind the scenes. This is echoed at the end of the film when it's revealed that the future protagonist has been using Priya as a false front within Tenet so that he can run his grand pincer in secret.
We've both been working for me.
If you've wondered why the protagonist and Neil still avoid the police, even though everything's cool with Priya by the time they show up, this is another detail that's addressed in the screenplay. Basically, the police would still have to file a report, which would identify the protagonist as someone in the Singh's orbit, and be available to people in the future. They pass that information to Sator, and the protagonist's cover is blown before he even shows up. That's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button to activate the algorithm. No, not that algorithm. The YouTube one that tells it to recommend this video to others. Be sure you're subscribed and have notifications enabled so you know when the next video goes live. And as always, thank you for watching.